town that made the most use of the Irish language. It was appropriate that it should receive the prize from President de Valera. For decades, he had promoted the idea of a distinctive Irishness of which the language was a bulwark. But while the ideal was not questioned, for the most part, it received only lip service. Now, in a modernizing Ireland that was more open to outside influence, the old assumptions about tradition and identity would come under heavy challenge.
Amharc Éireann na léiriú Gaelin.
Croke Park, 1959. At the headquarters of the GAA, the new Hogan stand is opened, one of the finest in Europe. No one could question the Irishness of Gaelic games. They were played nowhere else except among Irish exiles, and they were far and away the most popular sports in Ireland. In 1960, when Down became the first county from across the border to win an All-Ireland championship, the official attendance at Croke Park was almost 100,000. The GAA was still on the defensive. One of its rules prohibited its members from playing or even attending any of the designated foreign games: soccer, rugby, cricket and hockey. The ban, as it was called, became a source of mounting controversy and would eventually be rescinded at the GAA Annual Congress of 1971. There was controversy too about state policy for the revival of the Irish language, and most of it centred on what was called compulsory Irish in the schools. A pass in the state exam was essential to get the intermediate or leaving certificate, and a job in the civil service. But while the state declared its commitment to the language, it did little to promote it as a living tongue. In many schools, Irish was taught almost as a dead language, like Latin, something to be read and written. Parents who wanted their children to have some grasp of spoken Irish sent them for a few weeks to one of the privately run summer colleges. The burden of revival still rested largely on the enthusiasm of the voluntary sector. In the cities, there were families who tried to raise their children in an Irish-speaking home. But apart from organised events like a golf outing, there were few opportunities to use Irish socially. With a passive state policy that would not kill the language, but wouldn't help it thrive either, everything depended on the energy of the revival organisations. The Oireachtas was the annual highlight of Conradh na Gaeilge, the Gaelic League. Founded by Douglas Hyde in 1893, it had spearheaded a national reawakening that led to the achievement of political independence. But it had never regained the mass appeal of those early years. The attendance of the president and his wife, who both spoke Irish, and the Taoiseach, who could not, was a ceremonial symbol of the state's support for the language idea. But a new, energetic approach to the revival would come from another quarter. Gaelin had been founded in 1953 by a group of university graduates. One of its first schemes was to send city children to the Gaeltacht, where they attended a local school for a whole term and lived with a local family. It was a practical way of learning the language at source. And for Gaeltacht housewives, the Gaelins as they were called, were a welcome boost to their income. Another initiative among the young was the school's debating competition, with an All-Ireland final in Dublin's Shelburne Hotel. Gaelin was funded by a weekly pool on the results of Gaelic games, with its collectors calling at homes throughout the land for the shilling a week, and its sponsored radio programme that announced the winners. It was becoming one of the best-known organisations in the country. But it was through the mass medium of film that Gaelin would have its greatest impact on the public at large. In the late 50s, filmmaking was still seen as the prerogative of Hollywood or Britain. But having pioneered the weekly Amharc Éireann cinema newsreel, Gaelin commissioned director George Morrison to make 2 feature-length films on Ireland's struggle for independence. They were based on newsreels of the period that Morrison had unearthed in archives around Europe. And like the weekly newsreel, the soundtrack was recorded in Dublin at Peter Hunt Studios, where one of the speakers was the Amharc Éireann commentator, Pádraig O'Reilly. President de Valera is welcomed by the head of Gaelin, Donal O'Morán. The films Misha Éire and Saoirse enjoyed major success with Irish cinemagoers. Many of those who featured in them or took part in the independence struggle were still alive, and schools brought young people in their thousands to see the films in the cinemas. The music was specially written by Sean O'Riordan, and its popularity made him a national figure. His setting of the Sean-Nós melody Róisín Dubh became an unofficial national anthem. The Gaeltacht, Irish-speaking Ireland, was still romanticised by many as the real Ireland. Wild and elemental, unspoiled by the corruption of modern life, it was regarded as the wellspring of the language and the soul of the nation. But for all its picturesque appeal and its symbolism in the eyes of others, the Gaeltacht was in steep decline. It wasn't until 1956 that the geographical limits of the Gaeltacht were properly defined. And it wasn't until the later 50s that the Connemara Gaeltacht got the benefits of electricity. At a time of massive emigration from Ireland as a whole, the Gaeltacht was losing people faster than most other places. And many of those who stayed were abandoning a language that seemed synonymous with poverty. In 1958, the state finally established a body to promote economic activity in the Gaeltacht. Poorly resourced, however, Gael Para Éireann had only limited success in halting the decline of the Irish-speaking regions. Gaelin, too, were trying to develop Gaeltacht industries. In Tellon, County Donegal, they founded a woodwork factory for furniture, ornaments, even boats. And in Corna, in Connemara, they established a fish freezing plant to create employment and give added value to the catch of the local fishermen.
Is féidir an Gaeltacht a hábháil ach aber fáinta tarúil a thuirt go winter na háte. Seos céim a bháin a bhfuil a gairid i geal leis ach tá lán céim na Éire a teastáil a Connemara.
The people of the Gaeltacht got the message. With the Gaeltacht civil rights movement of the 70s winning the establishment of Údarás na Gaeltachta, Irish-speaking Ireland would finally escape the stigma of poverty and backwardness. While the language was having mixed fortunes, another aspect of native culture was going from strength to strength. The first national Fleadh Cheoil had been held in 1951, At that time, many dismissed traditional music as something from the bogs. But programmes on Radio Éireann were creating an audience for its distinctive flavour. And the Western world in general was rediscovering folk. In a wave of popular enthusiasm, the Fleadh Cheoil burst out of the competition hall into the streets and the pubs. The Ireland of the 60s, better off and more relaxed than before, found its ideal outlet in the Fleadh Cheoil. With over 50,000 people crowding into a small town for a weekend, there was a sense of carnival that was new to Irish life. And with the international growth of youth culture, the young people of Ireland were finding a new freedom in time to the music of their forefathers. The vitality of traditional music was to find an international audience, and not only in its pure form. It would blend with other styles, even rock, to help make Ireland a world centre of popular music. Sean O'Riordan pioneered a chamber traditional group, clár Cholan, a style that would later gain world success with the Chieftains. Traditional music was growing in popularity, but so was pop. In one of its record releases, Gairlinn tried to combine the international idiom with words in the Irish language. They had the help of some of the country's most talented musicians, including Ian Henry. But when it came to commercial popular music, the Irish youth audience preferred the real thing. Acker and his jazzmen made a successful tour of Ireland in 1962. Throughout the Western world, the teenager had emerged as a new phenomenon and an important consumer of mass commercial entertainment. The adulation of the pop stars was approaching hysteria. When Adam Faith came to the Top Hat Ballroom in Dublin, the crowd spilled onto the stage and the band had to appeal for calm. And that was only a foretaste of things to come.
The Beatles agus á clí go mór trí chéile dá mór. Gortiú daoine buisiú fuinneogaí agus leitú glúisteáin, na mílte pump domáiste go mé ar winter na carach íochas ar ball.
The older generation was bewildered by the frenzy to which the new idols could drive their children. But Irish musicians had already learned the lesson. There was fame and fortune in the international popular sound. These were the days of the show bands, the Crickets, the Clipper Carltons, Dickie Rock and the Miami, Joe Dolan and the Drifters. With more money in their pockets and cars to get them around, young people were travelling miles to see them, not just in cities, but in ballrooms as big as hangars at country crossroads. The bands bussed all over the country. One of the most popular was Brendan Boyer and the Royal Showband. In Dublin's Capitol Cinema, they played at the premiere of their film, The One-Nighters. The showbands brought in electric guitars in the American fashion, and instead of sitting down to play, they stood or even threw themselves around. It was a mixture of concert and razzmatazz, and the young loved it. The pattern of youth was changing. Boys and girls had been educated separately and carefully supervised. Now the acceptance of parental control, inherited values, modesty and moderation, all was beginning to crumble in the more permissive 60s. Youth was learning liberation, and the lessons were mainly from America. For a while, it was the twist, one of the new crazes that were a far cry from the foxtrot and waltz of their parents' generation. And then it was the Madison.
Shipshatá Din and Twist, Irigias, mar show a rink in the Huida on Madison, Queel Dirachas Medicoga Black Clear. And Ish cared the word massive.
Art students were traditionally more bohemian, a bit ahead of their time. But others would soon catch up. As the 60s wore on, producing role models like the Rolling Stones, more and more young people would adopt, or at least admire, the life of sex, drugs and rock and roll. But there was one area of Irish life where tradition was slow to change. The launch of a new cookery book by Maura Laverty, who was also a well-known playwright. For most Irish women, their role, as envisaged in the Constitution, was that of wives and mothers. And it wasn't until 1973 that a woman could marry and keep her job in the civil service. With the quickening pace of life in the 60s, and as the live-in maid became a thing of the past, the new labour-saving devices took some of the drudgery out of housework.
Níon, Blanan, agus Snasan, and Glacia, and Tarlor, agus Nurivin she Kriechne, Jenin she Copante. An machine Níchan Shammer Humpla, and Níon agus a Frommy, and another Vachto a car Titchin. Ton two all she Nitte, agus a Gjon Mander, but she Tirim.
Certain leisure pursuits were considered suitable for women, at least for those who had the means.
Come out the shingle the man of your show, like our known ye rather a fat shingle.
Though in a lot of the golf clubs, they have yet to achieve full equality with men.
Tom no ogen the linie, so slechte action. Tawa eklichte Asia or no agus 30 pontastige lore vele snelle in ter Valley Elle, smacht to 4 km hampla.
The GAA was regarded as a conservative organisation, yet since 1904, camogie had provided Irish women with a full-blooded sport. For many years, there was resistance to the growth of ladies' Gaelic football, though it's now fully accepted with its own All-Ireland final. But in the early 60s, things were hard for women in Irish athletics. In Clonmel, County Tipperary, a charity event in suitable clothing was acceptable. It was even good fun. But when the Crusaders Athletic Club in Dublin established a ladies' section in 1948, it was condemned by the Catholic Archbishop, Dr. John Charles McQuaid. he expressed grave disapproval of permitting young women to compete in cycling and athletics in mixed public sports. While a few Irish women achieved international success through Northern Ireland, it would be more than a decade before women's athletics took root in the Republic. The days of Sonia O'Sullivan and Michelle Smith were still far in the future. Nevertheless, some women in the early 60s were broadening their aims and doing things that had been the sole preserve of men.
An chéad bhean Éireannach a thug léiméir Bernadette ní Gharamlaí a gael suas le titim, chuir in slua anspéisir fad sa man visniúil seo. Tá súlaga nach bhfuil éon aglára a féchann síos céirtá fuatha. Seo nuasaí á boga is sábhíonn só a bain tanmh as gachár an irde agus I gíslú ó héasca le fearbé. Go maran am rá go deo. Agus seo thugann na calíní fásta, tugann sé cum agus croth agus figúr deastóibh, chuineocht na buchailí a súil fiantara.
Lord Killannon of the Irish Olympic Council honours Ireland's first woman to win a black belt at judo. Bernie Berrigan of Dublin can get the better of 5 men in a row. But not every woman was able to break the mold. The concept of the body beautiful held sway, an idealized image of what women should look like. The judges were Ronnie Delaney, Tony O'Reilly, Ronnie Dawson, and, predictably, 2 unidentified women. And the girl who wanted to look attractive needed more than good legs. The beautiful body conformed to an American ideal, promoted in films and magazines. These were the days of conical breasts with separation and uplift, the tiny waist and the hourglass figure, though there was no sign of a cleavage. Girls who weren't built that way had to squeeze themselves in some places and pad themselves out in others to approach the ideal. In 1956, the Great Northern Hotel in Bundoran, County Donegal, a training course for hotel staff. Apart from teaching, secretarial jobs and the civil service, if they didn't marry, the work expectations of women were limited. The hotel trade, like the clothing industry, was regarded as a natural extension of female domestic skills. It made a profession of housework. But in the late 50s, more glamorous careers were opening up for women with good looks. With the growth of the fashion industry, a lot of girls were attracted to modelling. It was glamorous, it was a chance to show off in beautiful clothes, and it offered an exciting social life. Men wanted to be seen with a pretty woman, and the top models were paid to adorn product launches. Some became celebrities. But behind the glitter of the ramp, it was hard work. Fittings were tiring, and the rapid changes at fashion shows exhausting. The models were freelance, and only the stars made a living. At that, they earned little more than a secretary. There was fierce competition to be an air hostess with Aer Lingus. The pay was unusually good. The uniforms were attractive. There was the appeal of foreign travel. And you never knew what eligible man you might meet on a plane. It attracted girls from the best families, but it was hard work, some would have said menial. The satirist Miles Nagopoline observed that well-brought-up Irish girls were prepared to do at 30,000 feet tasks they would scorn at ground level. In December 1959, the first 12 Banrordí qualified as members of the Irish police force under Commissioner Daniel Costigan. Trained by a British policewoman, Doreen Prissick, they came from 9 different counties: Donegal, Leitrim, Limerick, Kildare, Galway, Sligo, Roscommon, Cavan and Dublin. For the first time in Ireland, a woman was considered to be capable of doing real man's work.